Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on Episode 9 of Chainsaw Man. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So, it's interesting that we're essentially starting off on the same scene as the end of the previous episode. Interesting in that I think it's somewhat emblematic of how MAPPA has approached this adaptation in that, I don't know. They do a lot of CG that I think is ugly, and they're reusing a lot of stuff while simultaneously getting 12 different songs for the ending, which I think is kind of wasteful in terms of money. You know, you could put that budget into making it look good. But I think it's also interesting because this is, to my mind, the first part where things get really, really real. I mean, yeah, the Eternity Devil was potentially, or rather, it had the potential to go very, very wrong. This is when, people start abruptly dying. And not only that, it's also clear that Denji isn't really unique, if that makes any sense, The Katana Devil, or Katana Man, or whatever you would call him, I've heard mixed accounts, and I don't think he's ever been really directly referred to. He is, I guess, the same sort of entity as Denji, albeit he's presented as much more competent. And as a result, this is a sort of threat that nobody has really dealt with before. And to make matters worse, he and this girl here, they're sort of talking about Denji's heart, basically. They don't say Denji by name, but they're talking about his heart and how they want it. Kind of like how the Eternity Devil had done. I do also find it interesting here that essentially the dying act of the Ghost Devil, perhaps under Himeno's thrall, was that it sort of yanked the pull cord on Denji again, sort of waking him back up, getting the chainsaws going. Because when you get down to it, Denji is really everyone's only hope of survival here. I mean, for Himeno, it's a moot case. Powers run off. We know a bunch of public security people have already been killed. I mean, at this point, it's basically like Denji and Aki. They're the only two left here. Now, I suppose it's probable that Denji doesn't really know what's going on, but I find it interesting that he's so, I guess, jovial given the situation. Now that I've watched the opening animation again, just to expand on what I was saying before about this being like a real shake-up, it was pretty clear that even if everybody didn't really know each other super well, there was a definite group dynamic that was forming between Denji, Power, Aki, Himeno, Arai, and Kobeni. And now that Himeno's dead, like, she was, I guess, the sort of outgoing and agreeable personality that sort of bound everyone together. Because thinking about it, without her, like, Denji and Power are basically people who need to be wrangled. Aki is up for the job of wrangling them, but he doesn't really have a sense of humor. Arai is essentially a non-entity, and Kobeni is really just somebody who's fun to pick on. So without Himeno around, like, there isn't like a nucleus that the group can sort of center around. And really, I don't think Makima can take on that sort of role, considering that she's, I guess, higher up, and therefore her responsibilities prevent her from being as chummy with them as perhaps any of them would like. So this is rather unfortunate for Denji, you know. He's getting a little distracted by things. Granted, you know, it's somewhat understandable as people are pulling guns on him and shooting him, but he's sort of confused about when he had gotten cut. You know, to me that indicates that Katana Man here is so much more skilled than Denji that he doesn't even recall being cut. And speaking of that discrepancy in skill, you know, it would behoove Denji to pay a little bit more attention, considering Katana Man literally went, you know, teleports behind you, nothing personal, kid. It's also telling that he chopped his minion in half as well. You know, Denji thought he would do a cool thing by taking a hostage, but it turns out, you know, taking hostages doesn't work against evil people who have no regard for life. So, despite this guy giving Denji and basically everyone else the business, he's very clearly not invincible. You know, he's definitely wounded by this encounter. So, I get the feeling that if maybe Denji knows what he's in for and he can fight on somewhat even terms here, he might be able to actually give this guy a run for his money. Now, this is an interesting scene. We're sort of being shown, I guess, the breadth and depth of this plot here. You know, Makima's been shot through the head. A bunch of other public security members have been killed. You know, notice I said Makima was shot and not killed. I mean, it's very clear that something's up with her, and I think this scene really cements in our minds that there is something about her that's not apparent, and, you know, maybe it's a devil she's contracted to or something like that, but, you know, apparently it takes more than shooting her through the head to kill her. And I feel like that's got to be a pretty disquieting thing. So, you know, naturally, if people are running off of the train as though there was some big incident, I feel like these two would be well within their rights to be wondering, you know, what's going on here. But they just sort of stand around and wait for Makima to come out all blood-soaked. You know, she's acting as if it's no big deal that she's sort of covered in blood. You know, perhaps her own, perhaps others, considering what happens. It's also interesting how she just casually says, like, you know, lunch is canceled. Now, this is the really interesting bit. She just lies, saying, you know, I wasn't shot. I mean, that's not true. She took a bullet right between the eyes. So, that she would lie about something like that, I mean, I guess it would make sense. You know, you don't want to reveal your devil contract. But at the same time, you know, she's definitely hiding something, saying like, oh yeah, I got shot in the head, but I'm alright, there's no wound or anything. That would be suspicious. And I think people would be right to be suspicious about something like that. So this is also something very interesting here. She's tasking one guy to get a bunch of convicts with life sentences. She's tasking another person to reserve a temple. And the idea is that she's going to try and help Denji remotely. Whatever that means, surely something really foul is going to happen. It's not going to be pleasant for anybody. See, this is kind of where I wish they had included that little bit with the Muscle Devil early on. Just because that sort of showcased a ruthless side of Makima, where she basically told Denji, like, you ain't eating any food until you take care of this devil that's just cropped up out of nowhere. And he just sort of has to go along with it. Because, this whole bit here about, like, hey, can you round up 30 convicts with life sentences? There's an element of foreboding to that. Because, if they've got life sentences, that essentially means that their lives don't matter. They're up for execution if, the country allows execution. Surely no good can come of this for basically anybody. I mean, the way Makima sort of talked about it, Denji's going to be the benefactor of whatever she's doing, but I mean, it's certainly going to be messy, I'd imagine. I feel like this scene's been a little extended, showing the actual convicts themselves being led to this Shinto temple. I'd imagine if I was a convict being taken to, like, a cathedral or something like that, I'd be a little wary about what's going on. I also find it interesting that they've just sort of let, like, one guy drag what remains of Denji around. Granted, he is only half a person right now, but even so, you're just gonna let one guy drag him around and make a big mess? Like, the least they could do is, like, one person picks up Denji by one arm and carries him like that, distribute the weight. So before this guy can actually help, he is squashed. And that's really the best way to describe it. It is though, like, the hand of God reached down and just sort of, like, squashed him into the ground with a finger. So it is telling that the woman here naturally assumes that Makima is the one responsible, and that, she needs to confirm with those other teams who supposedly killed her. Given that people are just dying left and right, it's safe to assume that Makima has in fact survived from their perspective, and now she's taking it out on them. She's decided to make her existence their problem. This is a rather foreboding scene with all the convicts sort of, like, lined up, bound and blindfolded, as if they are awaiting execution, which I suppose they are. It's also telling that the other public safety agents are blindfolded as well, as if, they kind of have to be around for this just because of happenstance, but this isn't really something they should be witnessing. It's interesting how we essentially get shots going back and forth of Makima wringing her hands and then the person being absolutely squashed and mangled. So I don't think we got this sort of, this back and forth juxtaposition, Like, we sort of knew what was going on, but we didn't get it like this. And, this is ultimately presumably a devil contract of hers. She is contracted with the devil that by sacrificing the life of a convict, she can kill a specific person, as long as she knows their name and presumably their likeness, so there's no mistaken identity here. It's almost Death Note-esque, but rather more immediately gory, which I have to say I find appealing. I have to wonder if Makima almost revels in doing this, because I feel like if she's able to just kill people based on a name, there's no reason why it would have to be quite so messy, I feel like it's almost deliberate. Well, I mean, killing them is certainly deliberate, but the method of death? Like, if nothing else, that's leaving a big mess for somebody else to clean up. I feel kind of bad for those two public safety officials. They don't really know what happened, but all they know is that there are a bunch of dead convicts and Makima sort of standing around. Like, there's no sign of how she killed them, but she definitely did, through her actions or otherwise. Like, I don't know, like, if my boss just, killed somebody, I'd be really unsettled to be around him too, even if that were part of my job description. Potentially killing people. Fortunately, it isn't, but I don't know. Now, this is a rather kind of a sad scene in my mind, because now Araya's dead too, so the group is now reduced to 4 people. It's not entirely clear what happened, if Araya had moved to protect Kobeni, but for better or for worse, through luck or good judgment, she managed to survive essentially an assassination. And, Kobeni hasn't exactly made a good showing in that bout with the Eternity Devil, but it seems like she does have some merit and skill after all. I mean, I'd imagine Katana Man here is not exactly in top form, but she's able to slice off his arm. She's willing to use Denji as effectively a human shield. She's skilled enough with a gun to be able to hit people, Like, that's something that kind of, I feel like, isn't often addressed, that, marksmanship is a skill. You don't pick up a weapon and immediately know how to use it, nor are you able to immediately hit a target, It takes, well, practice. If Kobeni's just able to do all this stuff, then, surely there is some merit in her being a devil hunter to begin with. Cowardice and anxiety notwithstanding. If anything, like, her anxious and terrified reactions are probably more understandable than the display she just put on. Like, you have to feel a little bad for Kobeni. I mean, this situation alone is probably pretty nightmarish, watching somebody get gunned down rather brutally, and then having the gun be pointed at you next. Obviously she made it out, so in a kill or be killed situation, she had elected to kill. And I have to say, she did that rather ruthlessly. Kobeni really is an interesting juxtaposition of skill and anxiety. 'Cause, I mean, it makes sense that you'd be shaken up about everything that happened, but still being able to be competent. Oh dear, Kobeni doesn't even know. I'm going to tell Himeno that I'm quitting after this. Good luck. I don't think a tombstone can accept your resignation, crass though it is to say. So it seems like basically everyone was attacked and basically everyone has been killed as well. Things are not good, to put it mildly. So, this is interesting. All of the other divisions are being absorbed by Division 4, and they are now under the command of Makima. Isn't it interesting how, after all of this, she has sort of benefited the most in a roundabout kind of way? I can't blame this guy for handing in his letter of resignation, although I do marvel at the fact that he managed to write one while covered in blood. I feel like maybe just like a quick call saying like, hey, I quit would suffice in a situation like this. So, this guy made the mistake of quitting before asking the tough question, Makima, how much of this did you anticipate? It's not lost on him that she's benefited from this, but seeing as how he already quit, he's not exactly in a position to hear the answer. Even if Makima were willing to share, which I think it's fair to say she isn't. It seems like nobody's particularly happy with Makima being in charge here. I mean, considering everything that's happened, fair enough. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.